evening from the Glasscock Family Foundation Ballroom at Cleveland State University in Cleveland. I'm Karen Kassler, Chief of the Ohio Public Radio and Television State House News Bureau. Welcome to this third and final debate between the two major party candidates for governor of Ohio. This debate is presented by the Ohio Debate Commission, a coalition of news organizations, universities, and civic groups that came together this year to create better debates for better elections. We welcome those watching and listening throughout the state on television, radio, and live stream, and of course, those here at CSU. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, Jerry Revish, anchor at WBNS 10 TV in Columbus, and Jackie Borchert, Columbus Bureau Chief for the Cincinnati Enquirer. And now I'd like to welcome our candidates, Richard Cordray and Mike DeWine. The format for tonight's debate was decided by the Debate Commission in conjunction with the candidates. Our debate will run for 60 minutes. Let's go through that again. The format for the debate was developed by the Debate Commission in conjunction with the candidates, and the debate will run 60 minutes. Both candidates will make opening statements up to 2 minutes long. Then the panel will begin with our questions. A coin toss determined that Mr. DeWine will make the first opening statement and take the first question. He will have 90 seconds to respond to that question, and then Mr. Cordray will answer the same question in 90 seconds. Mr. DeWine will then have 30 seconds for a rebuttal. There will be no candidate-to-candidate questions allowed. Candidates will each have 90 seconds for a closing statement. And we remind everyone in the audience to mute your cell phones and to refrain from all applause, otherwise making noise or attempting to participate in or affect the debate. No photography or recording is permitted. And with that, let's begin. Mike DeWine, you have 2 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you very much. Well, let me thank Cleveland State for hosting us tonight on this beautiful day in Cleveland. I run for governor, and I will bring to that job the same passion I have brought to the job of Attorney General. I will fight each and every single day for the children of the state of Ohio. Our goal is that every child in the state, no matter where they're born, who their parents are, what their situation is, they ought to have a shot at the American dream, and I will do everything in my power to make sure that that happens. We will start with early childhood development. It's important for every child to reach kindergarten and reach there so that they're at the starting line. And if you look at our plan, it's on MikeDeWine.com if you want to see the whole plan. We have a very ambitious plan in regard to early childhood development, something that's never been done to this extent before in the state of Ohio. Our career centers, boy, we have some great career centers in the state of Ohio. We will take them to the next level. Our goal will be for them to be world class and the best in the world to preparing young people, and some maybe not so young, for a great career. We also have to keep our college expenses down, the cost. We see this with college kids today who are coming out with tremendous debt, which is really impacting their lives. We're going to do everything we can to keep those costs down. Let me talk about the drug problem. We have a 12-point plan that's realistic, it's practical, doable, and it will make a huge, huge difference. We start with K through 12 education, probably the cornerstone of it. But we move from there to the drug courts. We believe there should be more drug courts. We believe also in more treatment, but we also believe it's important that after treatment, we have a plan to help people after that treatment as well. I look forward to this debate tonight and the opportunity to share more ideas. I would appreciate your vote.
Mr. Cordray.
This election will decide our future, so don't misunderstand. The issue between us is not personal for me. It's bigger than that. It's about all of us and how we can move forward together. The governorship is not a gold watch to be given to whoever's been around the longest. Mike DeWine has had a long run, but on key issues, he's moved Ohio backwards. On consumer protection, he has not stopped the insurance companies and the drug companies from hiking our health costs to among the highest in the nation. On law enforcement, he was in charge as Ohio became the worst state in the nation for opioid deaths, other than West Virginia. In Washington, he backed a big business agenda that ultimately broke the economy, tax cuts for the rich, letting Wall Street run wild, and trade deals that both Sherrod Brown and Donald Trump have said were the worst ever. We need new leadership to move forward. Betty Sutton and I know we can do better. Here's how. We'll take on the big drug companies and greedy middlemen to bring down healthcare costs. And we will make sure that no one loses their coverage because of a pre-existing condition. We will put in place drug policies that are tough and smart, that will crack down on drug dealers, take out fentanyl from Ohio, and provide more treatment to beat the opioid crisis. We'll create an economy that works not just for some at the top, but for all of us, with pathways to the middle class for everyone who's willing to work hard. Mike, you've had your chance for 42 years. It's time you stepped aside. And it's time for Ohioans to step into our future. This is about taking on the tough fights, who you stand up to, who you stand up for. I have always stood up to the same special interests that bankroll his campaigns, and I will always, always stand up for the people of Ohio. Thank you.
All right, let's have some questions. The first question is to you, Mr. DeWine. You have 90 seconds to respond. Mr. Cordray then has 90 seconds, and then you have 30 seconds for a rebuttal. You have both said that you would work to protect Ohioans with pre-existing conditions and that you support Medicaid expansion. You've also said you want changes such as work requirements. If the Affordable Care Act is repealed, what specifically could you even do as governor to protect Ohioans with pre-existing conditions? And with regard to Medicaid expansion, the Center for Community Solutions says 96% of people would be exempt from work requirements.
Karen, first of all, I have always supported coverage of people who have a pre-existing illness. How in the world could you have a family as big as we have and not understand the medical problems that people have today? Mr. Cordray continues to run these ads that say, I don't, and he knows better than that. He knows better than that. Rich, you know better than that. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, 7 different times I voted in favor of covering pre-existing when I was in the United States Congress. And one of those, several of those were the very bills that were underlining. So let's say that Obamacare does go away. We still have the federal law in effect as far as coverage. If we wanted to improve upon that, we can do what other states have done with a high-risk pool. We've had 35 states that did that in the past. So those are all things that certainly that we could do. As far as Medicaid expansion, we just do have a little difference of agreement. We're both for Medicaid expansion. I think there needs to be a work requirement that's not punitive in any way, but is rather to try to get people back into the game, help them, those who have a addiction problem or those who do not have the skill sets that they need. We also have a wellness program in there, which I think is going to make a huge, huge difference.
All right, Mr. Cordray, 90 seconds.
I think the issue on pre-existing conditions, I wouldn't pay attention to anything he says tonight because we have a record of 8 years of what he's done on this issue. There's only ever been one law in this country that protected people with pre-existing conditions, and it was the Affordable Care Act. Everything else he talks about was ineffective to protect people in that situation, as shown by the fact that we had to have the Affordable Care Act in 2010. And ever since, Mike DeWine has been flatly opposed to it. On his first day in office, he filed a lawsuit to set it aside in its entirety. If he'd had his way, people in Ohio, 4.8 million Ohioans with pre-existing conditions, would not have protection today. And if he'd had his way, we never would have had the Medicaid expansion in Ohio because his lawsuit would have wiped it out all across the country. Fortunately, he failed. But taking taxpayer dollars to try to take away health care from people, that was a DeWine double cross. And taking taxpayer dollars to try to wipe out Medicaid expansion, which has done so well under Governor Kasich in this state, that was another DeWine double cross. Now, why has he done this? He says, why would I do this? He's gotten $2.5 million over his career from drug companies and insurance companies. Maybe that's why. They sided with him in that lawsuit. It would have felt good to be able to drop people off the rolls just when they became expensive. We knew he was going to say this tonight, so we are releasing a letter tonight under Mike DeWine's signature, his first day in office, where he tried to set aside the Affordable Care Act and pre-existing conditions in its entirety. It will be on our website at cordrayforohio.com.
Mr. DeWine, you have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
Rich, you just think that Obamacare is so wonderful and that's the only way that anyone could have coverage of pre-existing illness. That's simply not true. Many Ohioans didn't like Obamacare in regard to taking away the rights to be able to pick your doctor, the individual mandate, many other reasons. And let me just add one thing, Richard. On this stage today, there's only one person who has sued the drug companies, sued all five major drug companies, and we have sued the middlemen as well. You did not do that when you were Attorney General. I'm the one on the stage who has done that.
All right, next question, Jerry Rebish.
Mr. Cordray, the state's Budget Stabilization Fund, better known as the Rainy Day Fund, stands at almost $3 billion tonight. It's supposed to be used as a cushion against hard economic times in Ohio. Many municipalities across the state are already experiencing hard times right now. If you're elected governor, would you use that money to help them?
First of all, what I would say is, and I've been clear on this, we do not need to raise taxes in Ohio. What I will do is raise paychecks. Now, let me talk about the state's fiscal situation. The Rainy Day Fund right now is at its statutory maximum. It's at 8.3%. It can only go to 8.5%. So we cannot add more to the Rainy Day Fund significantly. Instead, what we've been doing is we ran a surplus, significant surplus in the last fiscal year, and projected to run another fiscal surplus in the coming fiscal year. It's time for us to consider what investments we will make to strengthen Ohio's future. We will invest in early childhood programs, early childhood learning programs, strengthening the foster care system, more home visits for pregnant mothers, and all-day universal pre-K across the state. Children aged 0 through 5 need significant resources. This is actually a point of consensus between the campaigns, and I'll be able to work with the legislature to deliver this on a bipartisan basis. We also need to invest in workforce development. We need to strengthen skills training, apprenticeship programs, certification programs, our great community colleges. These are things we need to do to strengthen the workforce in Ohio. And I have said we need to support our small and medium-sized businesses across the state and fire up our infrastructure. I have a package I'm going to put forward on that so that we finally fix the roads and bridges, and we invest in public transit and do broadband access. These are investments we can make. They'll strengthen the state. They'll create good jobs. They'll spread out opportunity.
Mr. DeWine.
What's interesting, if you total up all the money that Richard says he's going to spend, there's absolutely no way that you could do this without raising taxes. It's abundantly clear that he wants to raise taxes, if you look at some of the comments also that he has made about that. But let's talk about the Rainy Day Fund, but also let's talk about local government. I think there's no doubt that local government has really been hit in the last few years. They've been hit with the drug epidemic, and as many people in local government have told me, they do not have the money that they had from the state before. I think that it would be irresponsible for me at this point, not knowing exactly where the budget would be or what the economy is, to say exactly what you're going to do in regard to local government. But I served at local government level. I started as a county prosecuting attorney. I represented all local government. I know that in the state of Ohio, the way we like it in Ohio is local. And that means that local government delivers the services, even many of the services that come from the state of Ohio. So I'll be someone who will listen. I'll be someone, I have said that we will dramatically increase the money that we're giving to children's services. We have 2 pilot projects that we've started in the Attorney General's office to help foster care and children's services. We're going to expand those to all 88 counties when I'm governor of the state of Ohio. So real help coming in regard to our child welfare system.
Mr. Cordray, 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
That's a lot of talk about local government funds without being willing to make any commitment to restoring the local government funds. Let me be clear. I have made a commitment to restore local government funding in Ohio. It's really important. We can't be taking money out of local communities who are very cash-strapped, taking it to Columbus and not bringing it back. That induces local economies to be in recession, and it also forces localities back to the ballot on sales and property taxes. We're going to keep property and sales taxes down by restoring local government funding in Ohio. That's an important thing to do, and it will definitely help all across Ohio.
Next question to Mr. DeWine comes from Jackie Borchert.
Somewhat related question comes from Ohio State University political scientist Paul Beck. It's conceivable the next governor will face an economic downturn during his term in office. If you face such a downturn with a resulting decline in state revenues, what would you do? Which state programs would you protect the most?
Well, first of all, to answer Paul's question, the Rainy Day Fund is there for rainy days. It's there in case the economy starts to go really, really down and you have a major problem. So certainly you would look to that at that particular time. I think, though, that the goal of the governor of the state of Ohio should be to grow the economy. And that means the economy in every part of the state, not just in one particular part. John Houston and I have a plan. It is a plan in regard to opportunity zones. These are zones that the tax bill that was passed through the Congress and by the President of the United States, signed by the President of the United States, designated particular areas in the state of Ohio. Actually, Ohio designated those, but it's done through the tax bill. We will double down on that. What we will do is say that we will have that same tax opportunity for people. What that means is there's going to be more investment that's going to be made. There isn't enough government investment to invest in all our areas in the state of Ohio. We have to have private. It's going to pump money into those areas. When you put that together with what we're going to do in the area of career education, both for those who are in school now, the young people, but also mid-career as well. We have a plan, for example, to create 10,000 nano degrees, which is something that I think that people will be very excited about.
Mr. Cordray, 90 seconds.
So I think if you get around Ohio and get off the interstates and out into the small and medium-sized communities, it's raining. And people need help. That's why I've pledged to restore the local government funds. We're running budget surpluses. Those budget surpluses are made up of money that come from the communities around Ohio, and they should have that money. And in eastern Ohio, the oil and gas money, some of that should be returned to help the communities bear the burdens of that. Now, he talked about growing the economy. We should grow the economy in Ohio, and we will grow the economy in Ohio, but his plan will not do it. He has a so-called prosperity plan that only helps those who are already prosperous. It's built again on more tax cuts for the top 1% that does not trickle down to Ohio. Never has, never will. And he wants to loosen the reins so that Wall Street can continue to blow up our economy with irresponsible actions. And other than that, his program is very thin. What I have said we will do, Betty Sutton and I will do to grow the economy. I mean, how can you grow the economy without talking about small businesses and supporting them? How can you talk about growing the economy without investing in the infrastructure that we know has been deferred across the state, including access to broadband, an economic development issue in big pieces of the state, and investing in public transit so people can get from home to work? 27 counties have no public transit. Getting local government funds back into the communities. And what we need to do above all is help our businesses grow and help our workers get the investment they need to have the skills to fill those jobs.
Mr. DeWine, 30 seconds for rebuttal.
Richard, tell the people who live in the opportunity zones, tell the people who don't have jobs, tell the people who are a long way from jobs that they shouldn't have money invested in those. Tell them that. This is something that will help the poorest people in the state of Ohio. It is not just in our inner cities, but it's also in our rural areas as well. It will create that opportunity for that money to come in for investment. That is vitally important.
Here's another question that was inspired by those that were sent into the Ohio Debate Commission's website. This one from Doug Reffitt of Galloway, who noted that last year the FCC voted to repeal the net neutrality rules set in place by the Obama administration. The federal government and the entire broadband industry is now suing California over its new net neutrality law. So, Mr. Cordray, what would you want to see Ohio do in terms of net neutrality?
Okay, I thank Doug for his question. In Galloway, he's a neighbor of mine, pretty much. What I have said about net neutrality is we should be standing for net neutrality. And everybody who uses the internet understands that they should not be discriminated against merely because some people have market power and others don't. And what I have said is I will join my friend, Montana Governor Steve Bullock, who has said that people who do business with Montana, companies that do business with Montana, IT companies and the like, need to observe the principles of net neutrality if they're going to do business with that state. And he told me when he first said that, a lot of people laughed. What do they care about doing business with Montana? But he then signed up New York and New Jersey, and people weren't laughing anymore. And I've told him I will join him in that effort. We should stand for net neutrality in this state. I will stand for it. And again, when we talk about the internet, we have to talk about broadband access. The disparities in school funding have been magnified by the fact that in parts of the state, some of the rural parts of the state, we don't have broadband access. Kids can go to school and work on the internet in school, and then to go home, they have to go to McDonald's to do their homework because they don't have access in their home. And we will make sure that the companies in Ohio do provide broadband access. We will make sure we fill in that map of the state. That's something I'm pledged to do as governor, and that will help us. It'll help farmers who use internet to deal with pricing and all the complications they deal with their crops. It will help us all over this state.
Mr. DeWine.
We have a great opportunity in this state in the next few years in regard to broadband. Where our highways go, where our roads go, where ODOT is fixing roads, we should open that up. And we should work this out with private companies, give them the opportunity to come in, lay the fiber down, so that we can reach every single part of the state of Ohio. It is essential that we do this, and we need to use that as really an opportunity. If you look at the education plan that we have, one of the things that we talk about is we are going to help schools and teachers have the equipment, have the technology that they need. And whether you're in Adams County or Brown County or Wyandotte County, wherever you are, if you're a child in the state of Ohio, you should have access to that. I want to go back for a moment to something that Richard said a while ago. He was talking about fentanyl. He was talking about getting rid of fentanyl in the state of Ohio. Issue 1, which he supports, and he's Richard, you're very lonely out there. There's hardly anybody else out there besides you. It will cause more fentanyl to come into the state of Ohio. In Ohio, it will become, for under 20 grams, it will be a misdemeanor with no jail time at all. Every state around us is a felony. Where do you think the drug dealers are going to come, Richard? They're going to come right here in the state of Ohio. And anybody who lives close to the border better get out of the way, because they're coming in. Nobody supports this, Richard, except you and the ACLU.
Mr. DeWine, Mr. Cordray has 30 seconds.
So on broadband, he didn't do anything when Donald Trump's FCC took net neutrality away. He wouldn't stand up to them. Now he promises he's going to bring it. Let's talk about fentanyl, Mike. Fentanyl has exploded on your watch. The Substance Abuse Monitoring Network report said law enforcement reports that drug cartels have flooded our state with fentanyl over the last several years. On your watch. Fentanyl deaths went from 70 a year, understand this, from 70 a year to 3,431 last year. Drug dealers have had a playground in Ohio. While you've been asleep at the switch, you've been the fentanyl failure for Ohio.
Time's up. Next question to Mr. DeWine from Jerry Revish.
Mr. DeWine, employers across the state complain they cannot find enough people to fill their available jobs. One of the biggest underutilized pools of potential hires in the state are restored citizens, ex-offenders, men and women with criminal records who've paid their debt to society and just want an opportunity to make a living. But many businesses are still reluctant to hire them. If you are elected governor, what would you do to change employer minds to get more of these people hired?
Jerry, you're already seeing some employers change their mind because of the fact they can't find people. But the governor has to lead, and I will lead in this area. The governor needs to be holding up programs that work. We have programs in the state of Ohio where businesses have started, and everyone in there is an ex-felon. Everyone is in there has been a convicted felon. We have other businesses that are expanding that. So we need to talk about that. You need to use the bully pulpit of the office of the governor to do that. We've had some reforms that the legislature has passed in the last few years in regard to what records can be available. We want to encourage people to hire a convicted felon. At the same time, we want to make sure that that is an appropriate position. For example, we would not want to change the law in the state of Ohio to say that the criminal record of someone would not be available in regard to if they were a sex offender. You would not want a sex offender being hired. You would want a nursery school to know that. So we have to be, my only point is we have to be very careful in how we do this. But the governor can lead. There are many businesses that are doing that. You're absolutely right. The number one complaint that I hear when I travel around the state of Ohio is we can't find people to work. I'll talk in a moment. I see the red light's on, but we'll talk a little bit more in regard to things that we want to do and plans about that.
Mr. Cordray, 90 seconds.
So Mike DeWine says a governor could lead. So could an attorney general lead. For the last 8 years, nothing has happened on criminal justice reform. Mike DeWine has been the chief law enforcement officer of the state, and his allies in the legislature have done nothing on this. We will have a hard time with criminal justice reform the way he's demagoguing issue 1. You'd think issue 1 was the only issue in this race. There's many issues in this race. I have said that the one thing we can't do is double down on failure with Mike DeWine's fentanyl and opioid crisis that has blown up on his watch. Issue 1 is one possible answer. I support it. The Athens County prosecutors put forward a plan. I support it. The Franklin County prosecutor and city attorney in Columbus, friends of mine, put forward a plan. I support it. What I don't support is doubling down on failure with Mike DeWine. Reentry has been an issue for years, and in Ohio we've made no real progress on it, other than Governor Kasich has done a few things. We also need bail reform in Ohio. We need to think about individualized determinations of who's being held in jail. That's something we need to do in this state. I will push for criminal justice reform, but Mike DeWine is setting up a climate where nobody will touch criminal justice reform, and it's the wrong path for Ohio. It's too expensive to imprison everybody. It is too inhumane to put drug offenders with a drug problem in the prisons where they get no treatment and they come out with a felony on their record. They can't get a job, can't get a license, can't get a student loan. It's a bad path for Ohio, and we need change.
Mr. DeWine, 30 seconds for rebuttal.
Richard, we could have some reform, but issue one is a total disaster. And I continue to bring it up because to me it shows a lack of judgment. It shows a lack of good decision making. When you're lonely out there pretty much all by yourself. In addition to the things I said a moment ago, what's been a real success has been our drug courts. This will destroy our drug courts because there no longer will be a penalty there, nothing hanging over anybody's head. California did it and they lost 60% of the people going in.
Next question to Mr. Cordray from Jackie Borchert.
Relations between police and the communities they patrol have become strained in several parts of the state, including here in Cleveland. What would you do to help skeptical Ohioans, especially people of color, have more faith in law enforcement?
Well, I think first of all, we could work on things like criminal justice reform. He says we could have some reform. We haven't had any while he's Attorney General. Certainly doesn't deserve a promotion on that issue. We also need people to understand that we need fair policing, and that comes about through proper training, all right? When the Tamir Rice tragedy occurred in Cleveland, Mike DeWine's response was to say we need more police training. But what has he done? You know how much police training they're paying for this year in the Attorney General's office? 0 hours. 0 hours. So that's a promise that was made that hasn't been kept. His budget is $40 million higher this year than it was last year. 0 hours for police training. Our law enforcement need that training. This is probably one of the reasons why law enforcement in this state are endorsing me, not Mike DeWine in the governor's race, because they know that when it comes to being tough and effective on crime, he hasn't delivered. Both the Fraternal Order Police and the Patrolmen's Association have endorsed Rich Cordray in the governor's race because I will take on the opioid crisis. We will drive fentanyl out of Ohio. Fentanyl has run wild on his watch in Ohio, and it's pretty precious for him to talk about what we need to do about fentanyl, misrepresenting issue one, which has nothing to do with drug trafficking laws. Anybody with 19 grams of fentanyl will be prosecuted and jailed under my watch as a drug trafficker in Ohio. But Mike DeWine has failed us on this issue. He's failed us on police training, and he's failed us across the board, which again is why law enforcement supports me in this race, not you, Mike.
Mr. DeWine.
I would invite anyone who's watching tonight to talk to your local county prosecuting attorney and to ask them whether someone who is in possession of drugs, let's take the fentanyl, let's say it's 19 grams, but where there's absolutely no other evidence except possession, if you think they can be charged with drug trafficking. Richard, the problem is you've never been a county prosecuting attorney and you don't know anything about it, and you're dead wrong. If you talk to prosecuting attorneys, what they will tell you is there's no place to go. And so that person with 19 grams, enough to kill 10,000, is that funny? 10,000 people?
It's laughable, your claim.
10,000 people, Richard. They will get no jail time. It will kill our drug courts. It's horrible. The other thing, let me talk for a moment about the group we put together. We put 15 people together. It was citizens from throughout the state of Ohio. They came back with some amazing recommendations that we have implemented and are now part of the core curriculum. Things such as how you determine if someone as autistic, someone might have a mental health problem. That's a life and death thing. We are teaching that now. Implicit bias, something that every police officer should understand what their biases are. This is revolutionary. We did it by putting a citizens group together. I'm very, very proud of what they have done.
Mr. Cordray, 30 seconds for rebuttal.
Anybody with enough fentanyl to kill 10,000 people needs to be prosecuted for drug trafficking, and they would be, Mike. You just got that wrong, and the newspapers have said that claim on your part is an outright lie. And on police training, you promised police training after the Tamir Rice tragedy. That's what we need to solve these problems. You've got a curriculum. It's gathering dust on a shelf. If you're not going to pay for the training, nobody's going to take it. Your budget went up $40 million, but you provided no hours of training for law enforcement in the state. That doesn't get the job done.
Mr. DeWine, you've talked a lot about being a local government guy, even in this debate, but you also issued an opinion saying cities couldn't set their own minimum wage levels, and your campaign has said that you've outlined ways to assist local governments, but even you said here a few moments ago that you couldn't make any promises on the local government fund. So how can local governments be empowered to take on fighting the opioid crisis, funding public transit, and other responsibilities under these conditions?
We will be a good partner. We will work with them. Now, Karen, what I'm not going to do is come in here and do what Mr. Cordray has done, and that's promise everything in the world to everybody. We don't know where that budget is going to be. But I will guarantee you, I understand about local government. What I talked about a moment ago and what we're going to do in regard to children's services is very, very significant. I understand police work. We have a plan that we will help every police department in the state of Ohio by using data. We have a state that is local government, 950 police departments, 88 county sheriffs. We like it that way. I happen to like it that way. I think it's good, but we have to have more help to those local departments, and we will be giving them that help. We will give our schools more help. For example, when you look at the problem of schools in regard to guns, in regard to a possible shooting in a school, we have a plan. We will provide that school with a mental health specialist. Every school in the state is going to get a mental health specialist, paid for by the state of Ohio. Every school in the state will get that type of assistance. We will also be up on the internet, and we will do this through a resource center that we have in Columbus and see if there are threats to that school. We have some schools that are doing that now. We will pay for that, and we will do that. So there's a lot of services. If our audience looks at our plan, you'll see a lot of things that we're doing for local government.
Mr. Cordray.
So I can't even really follow Mike's answer there. He's going to be a good partner, but it rings hollow because he's not willing to make any commitment. Yet somehow a sentence later he says there's going to be a lot of money. I can't add it all up. But I'll tell you what, he says he doesn't know where that budget is going to be. The first person who presents a budget next year is going to be the governor. And I know where that budget is going to be. I am going to be working to restore local government funds in Ohio. That is my commitment. If he thinks that's an irresponsible commitment, then he's not really willing to be a partner with local governments in this state. And what does this mean? Everybody thinks it's just nameless, faceless government. It's okay for the state to take their money and nobody will care. It drives people back to the ballot to raise local sales tax and local property tax, which hurts local economies further. It hurts the ability to fight the opioid crisis. You take those resources out of the community and don't bring them back, how are we going to do something extra, like fight the worst opioid crisis in the nation? Sorry, second worst. West Virginia's even worse. And how are you going to protect the safety forces, the police and firefighters who are having to be cut because this money is going to Columbus and it's a rainy day museum, look but don't touch. You know, we need to rethink what we're doing in the state of Ohio. We need to be a real partner to local governments. We need to be able and willing to make these commitments, and I am willing to make them. That's called leadership. To tell us, I'll be a good partner, we'll see, maybe down the road, that's not leadership. That's waiting till after the election to try to address the problems.
Mr. DeWine.
Richard, you've never led in any office you've held. You had a mess in Washington, 25% of minority, 25% of women. A GEAO report said that they felt discriminated against. It was described as a toxic environment. When you were Attorney General, you left the old rape kits sitting out there, close to 12,000 of them. You never tested a one. I had to test them. When I came into office, BCI was a mess. We fixed it, and we have changed it. You didn't touch it. You were 125 days behind.
We need to move on. Next question to Mr. Cordray from Jerry Revich.
Mr. Cordray, you say you want to reform Ohio's education system. Among your plans is a call to reduce the number of standardized tests students take.
That's right.
How much testing would you eliminate, and what metric would you use to determine whether a student is actually learning anything?
So there's a number of things that we need to do to improve education in Ohio. I've talked already about my early childhood learning program, which I think is quite important. We can't have kids get to K and already be well behind in the state of Ohio. But in K through 12, there's two things we need to do in particular. We need to think about the funding of our schools, and we need to think about what actually goes on in the classroom. On the funding of the schools, we need to get the money back from failing charter schools. They were so indulgent of ECOT. They so looked the other way. They were getting millions of dollars in campaign contributions, tens of thousands to my opponent, tens of thousands to his running mate, some of which has not yet been returned or given to charity. That money needs to come back into the schools. But what happens in the classroom, Jerry, is we've had way too many unfunded mandates laid on the classroom in Ohio, and they've piled up over the years. We have too much standardized testing, high-stakes standardized testing. Nobody does that when they get out into the workforce. We need to rethink our approach. And by the way, the ones who are telling me the most about this are our teachers. Our teachers are trained to teach. They need to have Columbus lay off and give them more latitude so that they can teach effectively. And some of these things, the school report cards, the school district report cards, they're almost cartoonish, and I don't really understand what purpose some of those are serving. But we will reduce testing to the federal minimum, and then we will look to see if we can get some waivers to reduce it further. Because teachers tell me there's so much time out of the classroom, there's so much time spent preparing for the test, they can't engage the students and create the magic in our classrooms that has raised all of us in Ohio.
Let's move on to Mr. DeWine, 90 seconds.
We've found something that Richard and I agree on, and that has to do if there's too much testing. When you talk to teachers, when you talk to students, when you talk to parents, needs to be less testing, needs to be more learning. Fran and I have 8 children. One of our youngest son is a teacher, his wife is a teacher, and so we see some of these things through their eyes as well. Early childhood development is the most important thing that we can do. That's why we have a plan to triple the number of home visits to at-risk moms. Meet that mother, talk to that mother, go into her home when she is pregnant with that child, help her with nutrition, help her with education, help her to become a mom, help her to do what needs to be done to prepare that child to go to school. Our challenge in this state is that we need to get kids ready for kindergarten. We need them to be at the starting line. That should be our goal. Some kids are coming into kindergarten, they have half the vocabulary of other kids. We have to change that. That's why we have a very dynamic plan to do that. We also will improve early childhood education. The state is paying for some early childhood education. The tragedy is that 80% of that is not excellent, it's not high quality, and we know from statistics that it has to be high quality or it does not really make the difference. More on education later. I'm out of time.
Mr. Cordray, 30 seconds for rebuttal.
So I am glad that you have agreed with our plan on K through 12, Mike, and I think we've also agreed on early childhood. So that's two good things. Where we haven't agreed is the mess and the scandal in state government that is ECOT. $186 million stolen from the state of Ohio on your watch. No accountability for a school that had a 39% graduation rate, and you did not file a lawsuit until you actually were running for governor, and all the money was gone, and we will not get that money back on your watch. Maybe some future attorney general will do something about it.
Next question, Jackie Borchert to Mr. DeWine.
Ohio spent just $40 million last year on public transportation, less than 1/3 the recommended amount. And local transit authorities are facing a loss of $209 million in sales tax revenue next year. In what would be your first state budget? What role should state government play in supporting mass transit, and how will you ensure access to public transportation that meets Ohio's needs?
The state has to play a role. The state has to be a good partner. I will do what I will do in other areas, and that is I'm a very good listener. I'm someone who travels the state a lot. I will be in every community. We will listen to what the leadership of Cleveland, for example, says about that. One of the big problems that we see is people who live in one area, but their jobs are another. They are poor. They do not have the transportation. So that has to be a real focus. Now, one of the things that John Houston and I want to do, that Mr. Cordray apparently is against, but is to double down on the enterprise zones, because what we can do by having the enterprise zones and opportunity zones is encourage businesses to invest in those, and you will have the jobs there in the area where people are. That makes a huge, huge difference. I want to respond for a moment in regard to ECOT. Richard is wrong about ECOT. I'm the only person, again, on this stage who has taken action against ECOT. And it was not when the election started, Richard. It was well before that. I took action. I sued ECOT. Richard did not. I have been all over ECOT. We have won at every stage of the case all the way through. No action could not really be taken until the Department of Education made a decision. Once they did that, we filed suit, and we were all over it.
Mr. Cordray.
You're all over it, but the $186 million is somewhere else and not in the state's coffers. The question was on public transit, and all I heard you say was the state has to play a role, but you won't tell us what it is. I've said very specifically what I'll do. We will put a bonded finance package on the ballot for the voters to approve. They've approved infrastructure 4 times in the last 30 years. Revolutionary, for the first time, we will support public transit as part of that. We will get that in place. Why is it important? Because we need to make that investment in Ohio. Half the states have that investment, we don't. But secondly, we need to get that in place because eventually the federal government, which promised infrastructure but hasn't delivered, will bring it and bring funding. If we have our plan already in place now, while interest rates are low, which is the smart thing to do, there likely will be state and local match on that federal program. We'll have our ducks in a row and we'll be able to leverage the maximum federal funds to really build public transit in the state. But to have 27 counties where there's no public transit, you can't get from home to work unless you have an operating vehicle, is unacceptable in Ohio. And we need to think about that, particularly in our cities. We know public transit is a crying need. We've never financed it. To say that the state has to play a role, but he's not willing to do anything. I've heard him talk about blue ribbon commissions, which is another excuse for I'm not ready to lead, but we'll tell you about it sometime after the election. Doesn't get the job done for places like Cleveland, who need to see a commitment and leadership from the state government on this. And I have a very specific approach that Betty Sutton and I have laid out that will help us get this done.
Time's up.
Richard,
Mr. DeWine, 30 seconds.
You spend most of your time on the attack instead of talking really about what you think should be done in the state of Ohio. And again, you continue to mislead people on ECOT and so many other things. ECOT was something that you could have taken action on. There was a auditor's report which clearly showed that there was a problem, and you did absolutely nothing at that time.
Mr. Cordray, several people from around Ohio submitted questions to the Ohio Debate Commission regarding abortion, specifically the law in the state to defund Planned Parenthood, which is now in federal court, as is the ban on abortions after a Down syndrome diagnosis. If you win as governor, it's possible and even likely that you'll be working with a Republican-led legislature, which has helped pass some of these laws, actually has enacted these laws. With this in mind and the confirmation of Judge Brett Kavanaugh now on the Supreme Court, how would you keep your promise to protect reproductive rights?
Okay, the first thing I will do is I will protect reproductive rights. Betty Sutton and I will protect them in this state. Mike DeWine has had no respect for those rights. He's gone so far now as to say no exceptions even for rape or incest. That's too extreme for Ohio. This legislature has passed 21 restrictions on a woman's right to choose in the last 7 years. And Mike DeWine has cheerled them all and defended them all, even the ones who were unconstitutional, even the ones where you and I ended up paying attorney's fees to the party out of taxpayer monies. I will tell the legislature, don't bring those bills to my desk because I will veto them. He has said he will sign a heartbeat bill. That heartbeat bill will set back the business climate in the state because it's too extreme. John Kasich vetoed it, but Mike DeWine has said he will sign it. A woman's right to choose is something, and to make their own health decisions is something we should be protecting in Ohio, and I will protect it. Let me say what else. If we get this out of the way, this obsessive, manic obsession with defunding Planned Parenthood, taking away health care there, and restrictions on abortion, we can actually make progress on maternal health issues where the legislature has neglected them. Prenatal care, postnatal care, infant mortality, which we know is a crisis in this state, particularly in the African American community. The legislature has done nothing about it. We need to reprogram them in a different direction so they can be more helpful in terms of helping the state move forward on real problems that we're experiencing right now.
Mr. DeWine, you have 90 seconds.
Karen, thank you. I'm pro-life. As you know, Fran, I have 8 children. We value human life, as all people do, whether they have children or don't have children. But I believe that the essential function of government is to protect the most vulnerable members of society. That includes the unborn. It includes moms who are in very difficult situations. It includes babies who because the mom doesn't have the right nutrition or is taking drugs or other things. So you're going to see an administration, and we talked about this already before, that's going to spend a lot of time and a lot of focus and put significant money on early childhood development, but we're going to start with home visits early on. We're going to take this from covering, we only now cover with home visits 4% of the eligible women in the state of Ohio. We're going to take that the first year from 4% to 12%. We will do more than that as we go forward, because I truly believe how we take care of those kids early on and how we help moms and dads take care of those kids, moms and dads who are in difficult circumstances, is going to make a huge, huge difference for that child, for that family, and for the rest of the state.
Mr. Cordray, 30 seconds for rebuttal.
We agree about taking care of kids early on. Where we don't agree is your extreme agenda that even in cases of rape and incest, a woman could not exercise her right to choose. A 15-year-old gets raped by her uncle, and she'd have to carry that child to term, that fetus to term, because you as a man are going to dictate to her from Columbus and say that this is the way it has to be for everyone. That's wrong. That is not respecting rights. That is trampling on people's rights. Grown women have the ability to make their own decisions. They should be respected in the right to do that. It's been honored in the U.S. Constitution, and it should be upheld in Ohio.
Next question to Mr. DeWine from Jerry Ravish.
Mr. DeWine, you would freeze tuition so students would pay the same price they're charged as freshmen for all 4 years of college. Would you increase state funding to colleges and universities whose budgets may be too tight to accomplish that?
Jerry, I think that the people who we appoint to the board, and one of the most solemn responsibilities of a governor is to appoint people to the board of trustees or state universities, need to understand that young people cannot pay what they've been paying, and that the debt that is piling up on young people is wrong. We have to start running our universities more like a business. Now, they're not exactly a business, but there's a lot of parts of them that are. And so having people in there who understand that is very important. What you're seeing in the state of Ohio at most state universities today and at private universities is they are reinventing themselves. They're figuring out, how can we get by? Some of them are going out and trying to get transfer students. Some of them are looking at people who are not typical college age and are making a real pitch for them. Those are the type of things that have to be done if our colleges are going to continue to be good in the state of Ohio, and if they're going to be able to supply for a reasonable price what the students need. So it's the ability to adapt, it's the ability to modernize, it's the ability to take new technology to the heights that needs to be done. And that's what the leadership of these colleges have to have, these universities have to have.
Mr. Cordray.
Let me talk about the pattern of what we've seen tonight, and we've seen it in all these debates. Time and again, we have an issue, an important issue, and Mike DeWine's comment is, somebody will figure it out later on. I don't know what we're going to do. Somebody will decide. I'll name an opioid czar. Somehow they'll solve the opioid crisis. I'll name people to the boards of regents, and somehow they'll figure out how we keep costs down. I'll name somebody to be a partner with local government. We don't know what we're going to do for them. The state has to play a role in public transit, but I don't know what that role is. Governor's office is about leadership. The governor sets the agenda. Then the governor has to work with the legislature to implement that agenda, but there's a lot the governor can do on his or her own, and that's important, all right? On the issue of higher education, I have said we need to have more 2+2 programs, working with the community colleges to make college more affordable. We need to work to get more college credits available to students in high school so they can get a head start on this. Our great community colleges are an excellent alternative for people, a very affordable alternative, and we can invest more in them. We can also work as a state to optimize federal student grants and loans, make sure we're pulling down every dollar for families who really don't know how to navigate this. Many of them don't even fill out the FAFSA. We should have universal FAFSA completion in Ohio. That will help make college more affordable and more accessible to people. There's much that we can do, but the governor has to lead. The governor has to have plans. The governor has to be willing to spend political capital to implement those plans. It's not enough to say somebody will figure it out someday. We need more concrete approaches.
Move back to Mr. DeWine for 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
Sure. Richard, you have not led in any job that you've ever had. What about tell that to the rape victims?
Yeah,
right?
Right.
Right.
I
Tell
got
that to
started
the,
on
tell that
that,
to the rape.
and
You
you
didn't
know it.
start on that. There were 12,000 of them.
You know
sitting
that I
there.
got started on
One of
that.
the things
Claim
that
credit
I
for
think
my
is
work.
important is, and I will do as governor, is every state university, we're going to not only judge that state university on how many people they graduate, what percent, but I think that we can start looking to see where those students are a year after they graduate. I think we should judge them
Mr.
by
DeWine?
that, and it's important.
Now, unfortunately, we don't have time for another full round of questions. We only have 2 minutes left here approximately before we get to closing statements, so you each have 30 seconds to answer this question, and it comes at a perfect time after that exchange. I will start with Mr. Cordray. Can you say something
It's
that
his turn.
can you say something that you like about your opponent, like or admire about your opponent in 30 seconds?
Yeah, I know that Mike DeWine has always been a family man. I respect that about him. I'm a family man myself. As I said, this is not personal between him and me. To me, this is about how we're going to lead the state of Ohio. It's about all of us. That's what's at stake here. It's not whether Mike DeWine and I like or don't like something about one another. That's really not very important. What's important is how do we move forward so that Ohio makes progress? How do we move forward so that we solve these problems? How do we present the voters with alternatives so that they can know we're going to improve their lives? That's what I'm all about.
All right, Mr. DeWine, you have about 30 seconds to.
I think Richard's a great family man. I will tell you an anecdote. When I won the election, a close election against Richard the last time we ran against each other, he was very good in the transition, did absolutely everything that he could do to make the transition smooth.
All right. Leading on ending on a little bit of a positive civil note here. So let's go now to closing statements here, and we'll start with you, Mr. DeWine.
Well, thank you very much. I run for governor because I know that I can make a difference. Throughout my career, I've been able to take problems on and to fix those problems. And the way I've done it is to bring people together. And I've brought Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and got them together. I did it in the United States Senate on children's health issues, for example, foster care adoption. I have done it as the Attorney General on the rape kit initiative. I worked with Tim McGinty, Democrat, prosecuting attorney here in Cuyahoga County, along with the sheriff, along with the chief of police and the police department. We got those cases. We worked together to get those cases prosecuted. I have done the same thing with Sheriff Tharp, the sheriff in Lucas County. Sheriff Tharp, a Democrat, called me a couple years ago and said, I have a plan. I want to help get people who are at the hospital, who have overdosed. I want to get them from the emergency room, but I want to get them into a real good program for treatment. We worked together on that. It's been an amazing thing together. I worked with the former Democrat treasurer in Cuyahoga County in regard to a program that Albert Ratner also, Jim Rackauckus was the person who suggested it. He and I worked together to deal with the cancer that's been on our neighborhoods when our buildings and houses are falling apart. We had a program that made a big difference.
That's going to have to be your last word, Mr. Cordray.
Thank you to the people here at Cleveland State, to everyone here and everyone watching. Mike, I've enjoyed the 3 debates that we've had. These have been good conversations about the future of Ohio, and I don't think it should end there. I think the people of Toledo would like to see us debate there. I have been willing to say that I will go and have a debate there. I'd like to invite you to join me there next week. I think the people and voters of Toledo deserve that. Now, I've said many times that this race is about who you stand up to and who you stand up for. I have always stood up for people who have been abused or mistreated by predatory, powerful interests, and I always will. In Ohio, I stood up for our pension systems against Wall Street to protect taxpayers and retirees, and we beat them. We were effective. I stood up for brave servicemen and women who serve our country at the Consumer Bureau to make sure that they were not victims of financial predators, and we took them on and we beat them. I faced down the big financial companies to protect consumers and put $12 billion back in the pockets of 30 million Americans. You want to talk about my record there? That's what I did, Mike. Betty Sutton and I will move this state forward. On health care, we will make it more accessible and more affordable, and no one will be denied coverage based on pre-existing conditions. Skills training, support for small businesses, and beating the opioid epidemic. Tomorrow is the last day to register to vote, and Wednesday early vote begins. Betty Sutton and I respectfully ask for your vote, a vote to step into our future, a vote to put Ohio
right, Mr.
families ahead
Cordray,
of special interests, and a vote that
that's
counts.
the end. That's the
Thank
last
you.
word. Mr. Cordray, Mr. DeWine, thank you very much for
Thank you.
participating tonight. Audience, you can applaud now if you'd like.
Oh, Richard. Thank you.
All right, a little bit of business here. Okay. I need to remind you there are two additional candidates vying for the governor's seat, Libertarian Travis Irvine and Constance Goodell Newton running as a Green Party candidate. All four gubernatorial candidates have been invited to participate in a City Club of Cleveland forum on Monday, October 15th. You have been tuned in to the Ohio Gubernatorial Debate 2018, brought to you by the Ohio Debate Commission. On behalf of my colleagues, Jerry Revish from WBNS 10 TV in Columbus and Jackie Borchert from the Cincinnati Enquirer, I'd like to thank our studio audience and everyone who tuned in to the live stream this evening. I'm Karen Kassler. Thank you much, and good night.
Nice to be with you tonight.